difficult childhood.
Yeah, basically you're sort of the impetus from your own past that kind of set you on the discovery of this, what you want to write about.
Well, I grew up in California, and I didn't like it. And when I was 16, I moved to the Norwegian Arctic to become a dog sledder. And I live in Wisconsin right now, and I'm training for the Iditarod, so it's very much a current thing in my life also. But when I first went to Norway, I ended up in a situation with a very abusive father figure, and I was always terrified when I was in the house. I practiced climbing out my bedroom window, but I thought I was crazy, right? I couldn't trust my own instincts. I had great parents at home. I didn't have the context to know this is wrong. And I ended up, that first year ended up being really difficult, and I sort of lost track of the sense of adventure that had brought me there in the first place. And so I came back home, and I ended up going back when I was 18, and I moved even farther north. And I wanted to not be the fearful person I felt like I was starting to become. So that was when I was up in Lapland, 200 miles above the Arctic Circle, in a village of about 40 people, and I ended up staying there on and off for 4 to 5 years. Still go there every year and for a couple months. And so that's sort of what the book is about, is it's about being in this place of the north in, the high Arctic on the tundra and 40 below with dogs, and being sort of a young woman or a teenage girl at times in communities that were extremely male dominated. At times I'd live for months, I'd be the only female person on the frontier in a place where we had no access to the outside world. So it's about negotiating that gender, negotiating my own sense of courage and ability to go out and tackle the things I wanted to tackle without being terrified. Where, extreme wilderness and this very sort of tough, oppressive kind of masculinity and all these things wove together for me. And so the book was about going back to that village 5 years after I left and using it to make sense of what had happened to me and to sort of come to terms with that experience, come to terms with my relationship to the far north.
Nice. Ralph, where did you go next?
Yeah, so I grew up in suburban Illinois, and there I think it was not, my parents are they're not outdoors people, you would say. My dad, I often joke, won't even eat outside. He is a profoundly indoor guy. I sometimes think, some people think you have to filter water through a Brita water filter before you can drink it. Like, he thinks air has to run through an air conditioner before you can drink it. Like, he does not like to be outside. I remember even as a kid playing tennis indoors. In the summer, we would be in these big white tents playing indoor tennis. It was, like, grotesque, but it's something out of, like, a Philip K. Dick novel or something. It was bizarre, but that was, and so I spent a lot of time inside. I watched massive amounts of television. My parents were divorced, so my time with my dad, I would just be drinking 12 Dr. Peppers a day and watching television, and then we would go to a shopping mall or a video arcade. I mean, my life was very synthetic and artificial, and then my mom is an artist, and she was a little bit more in touch with the earth, but also not really a very outdoorsy person. So I didn't have much background at all besides my backyard. And then when I was 10 years old, my parents sent me to a summer camp in Maine called Pine Island, which is a peculiarly old-fashioned place. It started in 1903, and it hasn't really changed since. So there's no running water, there's no electricity. You've got little kerosene lanterns, and you bathe in the lake and all of that. And I was, way out of my depth. And so in the first week, I think, I went on this hiking trip to Mount Washington. It was my first hiking trip, and I hated it. I hated every moment of it. It was hard. It was painful. I dreamed about escaping. I actually had escape fantasies, and I joke in the book that when people would pass us in the opposite direction on the trail, I would make these pained faces, like it was all part of some elaborate kidnapping. Like I was not there of my own volition. But what happened on the second day was we went on a little day hike. It was raining, so we couldn't summit, and instead we just did this little circular hike around these various trails. And at one point we got onto the Appalachian Trail, and that was the first time I heard about what the Appalachian Trail was, and I can still remember the feeling of really like chills when I realized there was this thing that stretched across the continent from Georgia to Maine. And it was an unthinkable thing to me at that point. I couldn't imagine walking it. But as I went back to this camp year after year, and then I went and worked there, and then I would go on all these hikes in Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont, I would bump into these people who were thru hikers, and they were these like mythical creatures. They're so strange. They had these strange trail names and this long facial hair. And back then, this is before ultralight gear got really light, and so they had to make weird choices. And so they would one guy was wearing a kilt and like sandals, and another guy had a full feather pillow with him, but no tent, which I thought was like very hasty. But they were peculiar. Everyone was peculiar. They were just strange. But I just was so smitten by them, and I always had this idea in my head that one day, if I get the chance, I'd like to try this just to see if I could do it. And I didn't, as I described in the book, I didn't really have any great trauma I was trying to work out. A lot of people who go to the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail, most famously Shale Strait on the Pacific Crest Trail, have something they're trying to work through. And my questions were a little bit more abstract than that. I mean, of course, like everyone, I had my own emotional issues. I grew up a closeted gay kid in, a very sort of conservative, uptight place. But that wasn't really what I was there for. I was just there to be in the woods for 5 months and just see if I could exist there. And as I started walking, this is sort of the creation myth of this book is, and it's true, is that I started noticing other trails. First, I started thinking about, what is this trail? What does it mean that I'm following this line that someone else made for 5 months? I'm not in control of my own destiny. Someone else is telling me basically where to go. I don't know who that person is. I don't know why they put the trail where they put it. And yet also, if you look out into the woods, there's all these other trails. There's these game trails. There's deer trails. There's little, rabbit trails. And then you start noticing insect pheromone trails. I started to realize that trails are this really fundamental way that we stitch our world together and we make meaning out of the chaos of landscape. And so if you start, I go home and I start thinking about this idea and researching, of course, you find that paths are written about in every culture and in every religion. It's this very powerful metaphor, the way, the path, the Tao, the Sunnah. You find it in almost every culture. And so I set out to write this book, and 7 years later, I finally had it ready. But that's how I got there, I guess.
Your creation story. Right.
Yeah.
I had a wonderful childhood. Except for the fact that I was short, fat, and stuttered. I think I began to stutter after I made a campaign speech in 1944 for my father, who was running for the Senate. There's one. And I said, vote for my daddy. And I think I stuttered ever since then, which came and went. But possibly my love of water and snow came from the Scandinavian side of my family. My mother's mother was born Ida-Louise Åkerblad, and she had two sisters, Selma and Anna Åkerblad. And they had an influence on me. My grandmother, to whom I was sent to stay with often, I was about that high. Maybe I was 5, and she put me on a pair of skis. I'd never been on skis, and they were the old-fashioned Kandahar binding, which can be used to ski downhill or what's it? Telemark, so you can walk on them and ski tour. And she put me in the skis and sent me outside. This was in New Hampshire, and she said, go past the Dartmouth Outing Club, climb the hill and come down, and when you come back, I will feed you. The snow was about this high. I fell over. I couldn't get up, and I thought, well, so I looked back, and I saw the curtain peak, and I thought, she'll be out soon. No. No. So I struggled back, and I did that. And that in a way was, and I thought, this is actually kind of wonderful. Skis, what a great invention. And so and then there was a period in my life, I had an uncle who skied very well, and he would take us out on tours. And I had another uncle who lived in Paris, who was very, he was dressed beautifully. And I didn't find out he was gay until I was about 25, because this was a long time ago, and it was harder. And so I had a choice between uncles. Uncle Charlie, who wanted me to train for the Vasaloppet, which is an 85 kilometer. Why do I turn to you? Because you must know that. Yeah, the long thing.
Finnmarksloppet?
What?
Finnmarksloppet?
Well, yes, except it's named after
Yeah.
it's a long race. It's 85K, which is 50 miles and some. And so I thought, yes, I'll do that. But then Uncle Drew, living in Paris, said, well, John is never going to go into politics like his father because he stutters, and that you're not going to make a very good campaign speech, are you? And I thought, he said, but the Foreign Service, so we'll ship him off to Switzerland where he will learn French, which I did for 2 years, spoke nothing but French for 2 years, and so it comes back to me from time to time. And of course, I didn't do that either. I ended up going to law school where I got fat. and practiced law for an eye blink, and then met a man who said, you shouldn't be a lawyer, you're a writer. I'll stop there. I did. So I was in Iowa, where there's not a lot of downhill skiing. but I got a pair of cross-country skis and fell in love with it, just swooping around. And one of the things that's wonderful about it is that if you're going slightly downhill, Iowa is not flat. It rolls, gentle waves. And if you're going downhill and there are geese in a pond or deer, if you hide your arms so that they're not moving and just squat on your skis and go towards them, they say, that person appears to be growing, but they don't get that you're coming up on them, and you can get so close you can touch them. It's just amazing. It is amazing, and it's silent and whatnot. And you can't get lost because you turn around and go back in your tracks. So it was great. Anyway, that's how I fell in love with some of the things that you're in love with. Except I don't have dogs.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet, I like that. Well, she feels that about everybody, I think. So it's one of the things that Rob wrote. I was so struck by this quote, and I know this is hold on, I'm going to find this because it's beautiful. Which is that, I can't find it right now, but what I will have you talk about is all of you were struck by different people that you met, and the portraits that you created of these people were so vivid and so real. And so the counterpoint of the beautifully written nature scenes and these people that almost made the nature come alive. I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about one or two of the people that really sort of captivated you, who did have this connection to nature and kind of gave you that sense of that it was possible to do.
I should start.
Go for it.
Okay, well, the two that there are a lot of characters in this book, a lot of colorful characters. I was 27 years old when I started this book, and I'm now 31, I'll be 32 next month. But I was 27 years old. I didn't feel like I had a whole lot of wisdom to share with the world, and so I went out and I tried to find people who knew more than I did, and especially people who were like obsessed with certain kinds of trails, who knew a lot about a very particular kind of trail. So each chapter, I find a different character. And two of the people I find, well, the one I'll start with, I mean, by far the most colorful character is a guy named Nimblewill Nomad, that's his trail name. His real name is M.J. Eberhard, and he is a true American original. He's a guy when he was 60 years old, he went and hiked the Appalachian Trail, and then he kept walking on what's called the International Appalachian Trail, which continues up to Newfoundland, and they have actually now continued it over the Atlantic to Greenland, Iceland, all the way down through Western Europe to Morocco. So it's a 12,000-mile trail linking all of the geologic Appalachians. So it took me 5 months to do 2,000 miles. So to do the math, for 12,000 miles, it's unbelievable. No one's done it yet. But if anyone is going to do it, he's a likely candidate because he has never stopped walking. Since that hike, he came home, said, this is all I want to do. So he gave away all his money, gave it to his wife and his kids, who's divorced from his wife, and he went and in the winters, he lives out of his pickup truck. In the summers, he just walks. And so he walked all of the National Scenic Trails in the United States, the AT, the CDT, the PCT, all of those, all the ones you've heard of, all the ones you haven't heard of. Then he started walking these historic trails, and then he kind of ran out, so he started walking the highways, and he did this thing called the Great American Loop, where he walked up basically around the perimeter of the continental United States. And so I wrote to him, and I said, I would love to talk to you. You are someone who is a perpetual walker. That is, a theme of my book, and sort of how walking requires you to shed, right? It requires you to shed your excess belongings. It requires you to shed your excess mental baggage. It's a sort of kind of streamlining. So I wanted to see this extremely streamlined person. And I'd heard all of these urban legends about him because hikers always talk about him. That they said his backpack only weighed like 7 pounds, which turned out to be true. They said he cooked his food by putting one morsel at a time in a spoon and then heating it with a lighter. Like that. It's not true. It's stupid. You would never do that. And one of the other things they said was that he'd had all of his toenails surgically removed because his toenails kept falling out. This guy's so fascinating. So I wrote to him. I said, I would love to interview you. What do you think?
Write to him?
So this is the other thing that's interesting about him. He's actually very plugged in technologically. He's in his 70s, but he has a little iPhone, or no, an iPod. He doesn't use an iPhone, and he goes from McDonald's to McDonald's, and he steals their Wi-Fi. And then he answers emails, he updates, he writes these journals that he sends to someone, and she uploads them online. So he's like oddly plugged in that way. So I wrote him this email, and he wrote me back basically saying, go to hell, commie. Like, I will never talk to you. You are this lefty, liberal, environmentalist. I'm exaggerating, but that was the tone of the email. It was very much because I'd written for this magazine called On Earth, which was the magazine, the NRDC's magazine. And then I was like, now I really have to talk to you. I mean, now you're really fascinating because who is this guy who's a perpetual hiker who spends his whole life in national parks and on national highways, who doesn't believe in the federal government? I mean, he was, and I said, normally I would respect your wishes, but I'm not going to. I have to talk to you. I'm not going to leave you alone. So I emailed him for like 2 years. I kept emailing him. I just would write things to him. And finally he said, okay, enough. I will be walking. If you want to find me, I will be walking across this stretch of highway on this day. And if you can find me, you can interview me. So he'd been walking across Texas, and what he said was in West Texas, he walks through the deserts of West Texas, and vultures were circling over his head, like the old man in the cartoons crossing the desert. Like, that's what he looked like. And he almost died. He had a really arduous journey, but now he's in East Texas, so, the going was a little easier. I went out, fortunately my sister lives in Houston. I flew down, she got in her car with her, and I went out and drove along the highway and just past a place called Alligator Hole Marsh, which gives you a sense of what the landscape looked like. We found him, and he was just walking along the side of the road, this old man with this long white hair and this long white beard, and I jumped out and I said, Nimblewill? He's like, well, I guess you found me. So we spent 3 days walking together and arguing and talking about these really fascinating ideas about nature. I mean, he's a sort of, one of the things he says is, people always try and crop out the power lines from their photos. But once you accept that there are going to be power lines in your photos, you can take much more interesting photos. Like, he has this notion that he's sort of okay with the human landscape and even like a certain amount of like industrial pollution. I mean, he's really, it was very strange to me, and I tried to get to the bottom of it because we were walking through Port Arthur, Texas, which is a refinery town. It's like walking through Mordor. It's the most hellish place you've ever been. I mean, there's flames shooting out of the refineries, and the water smelled like kerosene. And I was like, Nimble, how are you okay with this? It's just, but he said, well, like, I'm not okay with it, but I don't want the federal government controlling my freedoms. And anyway, we get in these long, drawn-out arguments. But by the end of it, we kind of come to an understanding with one another and even a kind of affection for one another. And so on the last day, I worked up the courage to ask him about his toenails. I said, is it true that you had your toenails removed? And he sat down and he pulled off his socks, and sure enough, no toenails on any of his feet. They were just like little blind pink baby mice. It was really weird looking. And I said, and he said, you know, a lot of people think I'm out here on a lark. You try having your toenails ripped out at the roots and then have acid poured on them so they never grow back, and you tell me that's a lark. Like, all right, I believe you. You win. So yeah, he was by far the most colorful character, and he's still out there. He just walked the Pony Express Trail. I mean, you can follow him. Go to nimblewillnomad.com. He's written a couple of books. He's a true original.
That's remarkable. Blair, how about you?
You know, the other character in this book who ended up being a main character in the book, I mean, it's almost his book as much as it's my book, is the shopkeeper in this former seal hunting village of 40 retired seal hunters up in the Arctic. And he has this little shop on a jut of land, and his father ran the shop, his grandfather ran the shop. His grandfather's name was Johannes Kristoffersen, and that was the name of the shop then, and now the name of the shop is Johannes Kristoffersen's Descendants. And they just tagged that on. And I met him. I wasn't even planning to stop there, but I was walking through. I sort of knew him from having lived up there before, and I knew that he was always in everyone's business, this huge gossip. And I knocked on his door and I said, hey, you know, I think that if I remember right, you own this abandoned house that's about a mile away. You know, I was just sort of hitchhiking through. Can I sleep there tonight? Do you mind if I just go in that roof? And he was like, yeah, it doesn't exist anymore. Sheep got in the basement. We tore it down. And so I was like, all right. And I went up in the woods and I went to sleep in the woods. And the next morning, I almost didn't want to go back to the shop because it seemed like it was such an uncomfortable interaction, but it was the only shop for, you know, a day's trip in any direction, probably a third of the size of this tent. And so I went back, and he has a coffee table, you know, about this big, where all of the retired seal hunters, who are almost all men, just sit around telling stories all day. And I walked in, and they all looked up, and Otto, the shopkeeper, ran toward me and said, where were you? I was looking for you all night. I was going to offer you a bed and a taco. And I was sort of taken aback. I sat down, I had coffee at the table, and I didn't stand up for 3 months, basically. So I ended up moving in with Otto in this shop and running this shop with him, working with his sheep. And he became like an adopted father to me. We're very close. The book is dedicated to him, and he just is this sort of 70-year-old guy who is very, very gossipy. He keeps track of like every single person for hundreds of miles around. He could just tell you who they're cheating on their wife with, like who, whatever. And he's just run this shop his whole life. He's sort of trapped there. His only other job was when he was in the military, and he would take soldiers during the Cold War. He would take Americans to the border of Finland, and they could look into the mosses of the Soviet Union on the border, and he would tell scary stories. And he liked me because he's such a gossip, and I could provide gossip about the United States and all sorts of things, and he just sort of is a know-it-all. And every day he drives up into the mountains and he checks on all the bachelors, and he'll bring them soup, because otherwise they'll just eat open-faced sandwiches all day, and he can't let that happen. And he'll check on, you know, the older people who don't have family members anymore, and he'll pull me over and he'll say, this man doesn't like going to the outhouse, so he shits in plastic bags. And then he'll like pull out of his pocket like a bunch of plastic bags from the shop and he'll be like, we're gonna leave these here. And just sort of like this scheming, sort of like underhanded, he's very mild. He looks like a basset hound. And he's extremely unassuming and he has all these like big plots. And so I ended up, living with him on and off for years. And he became my family up in the Arctic. He still is. And the book is almost as much about his life as mine.
I just want to say something that your description of Farr, who was the bad father, this was the man who intimidated her when I think you were what, 14?
16.
16.
Neither of whom are my actual father.
Right. Her real father's a real person.
Yeah, and he's great. And he doesn't. He's like, why did you write this book about all these father figures who aren't me?
It's an interesting part of it, but to see the difference between these two men in terms of how they treated her and what she had to deal with, and the kind of either lack of self-confidence or confidence that either one could engender in her was amazingly well drawn.
Thank you.
I mentioned these two figures, both of whom are beautifully drawn. So. And
Ottold was not uncomplicated. I mean, he lived in this culture. There were moments that I was afraid of him, that I sort of came to realize that he wasn't dangerous. We came to love each other despite ways that we would argue or fight. So it was a complicated relationship, but one of the most important ones in my life. He finally read the book. He put it off forever just to torment me. And he called me back, and part of the book is on a glacier in Alaska with like helicopter crashes and like all this adventure, right? It's sort of the adventure part of the book. He called me back. He was like, okay, I read it. It's pretty good. But I just skipped Alaska. It was so boring. So that was a relief.
John, how about you?
Well, I love Harold. I am just crazy
Good job
about
with
it.
the pronunciation.
Thank you. And it was, and I tried to think, because I read both books a little while ago. Who was Harold to me? I had lots of mentors on the literary side, Peter Taylor and Kurt Vonnegut and a number of others, but students of mine, I teach in the MFA program at UVA, and occasionally someone will come in and just want to get there really fast. How do I get an agent? Where should I publish? And I'm thinking it's a little early for that stuff. But it finally occurred to me, and I semi-made up a conversation. I kind of amalgamated a number of people. And the woman comes in and asks, where can I find a mentor? And I go on about the Sanskrit origin of the word and a lot of other boring stuff, which she quite rightly became
God,
impatient.
you'd be intolerable.
Yeah, pretty. Well, no, because I made it very funny. Sanskrit is just a barrel of laughs. No,
I didn't know.
Anyway, at one point, she was still impatient with me because I keep talking about. There's one point where Peter Taylor and I were talking about a poet whom we both liked very much and is a wonderful poet, and he wrote a short story, and Peter and I took a walk, and Peter said, I don't know. And I said, yeah, it's elegantly written, isn't it? And he said, yeah, but it lacks that, well, he had a beautiful southern voice. He said, it lacks that low vaudeville cunning. And I thought, that is a genius remark. And so I tell it to the woman who I'm talking to, and she says, well, I guess I did ask for a joke. And I said, it's not just a joke. Truth, beauty, and low vaudeville cunning. All three. That's the triad. And so we go on, and she says, well, why? So what is the low doing in there? And I said, well, I had a housemate for a while who belonged to PETA, and she had a beagle that she named Bagel. And I like almost every dog I've ever met, except the ones that have actually taken a bite out of me, but that was, my grandmother had an Airedale that always came and bit me in the rump when I was and Bagel hid under the porch, and so I would go and lie down in the lawn and leave a trail of dog biscuits. There were 5 of them, and 5 days it took one, 2, 3, and finally he came up and took one from my hand, and Marianne came out and said, "You see, Baggy, he's a real person just like you." And I said, "For Christ's sake, we're just trying to get him to be a dog." And anyway, so a lot of time passed, and then I lived on an island which was 4 acres at high tide, 4.2 at low tide. No one else there for a while, and I got a wife and a child and another child and whatnot. But there was no phone, no electricity, no heat, and and no trees. But enough driftwood arrived so that we could heat by wood. And I was fishing one day, and there was a guy digging clams. A very good law, and I think it's all through the United States, but certainly in New England, you can't own below the mean high water mark. I think that's wonderful because everyone gets to dig clams, not just the quahogs, but the steamers and whatnot. And so I met this guy who had a gray ponytail down his back, and he taught me about clamming. So that was good because there they were, all ready to eat. And he said, "I've seen you casting for fish, and you can really throw that plug a long way." I said, "Yeah, but there are not many fish around here." He said, "Well, go down to the southwest rock when the bottom half of the sun turns orange and the tide is going out, cast past that southwest rock." And so I did, and something on the 10th cast, something took the lure and disappeared toward the Azores because I hadn't tied the knot right. So then he said, "Yeah, I forgot about the knot." So we went and got the knot, and then he did the northeast rock and so on. And this went on for quite a while. And then, and anyway, I'm describing this to some extent to the woman who wants the mentor, and I said, well, it's not just a sort of business thing. It's not like a Roman senator who has clients, and there are people who try to give you advice about a career, which is don't make friends, make allies. And I thought, that's not quite right. And I said, here's what a mentor ought to be, because I've been going on, and I said, I'm going to, and she said, you've talked about cats pouncing, you've talked about, seal hunters in the north and whatnot. And I said, yeah. And she said, well, get back to writing, for God's sake. And I said, well, I'll tell you, I wouldn't write if I didn't read a whole lot and hadn't read a whole lot my whole life. But I also wouldn't write if I didn't get out and bump into things. And she said, oh, really? Well, okay. But then, at one point I'm talking about a by-the-way conversation I had with an editor, and the woman said, you really like the by-the-way parts? I said, yep. The man who taught me how to catch fish, you're going there no matter what, huh? I said, taught me the first parts in very narrow detail. He was like an Inuit seal hunter, and they just say, this is what you do. It's not a Socratic dialogue with because there are not enough seal holes used or in use to try it out. So they just said, this is it. And so he gave me this advice about when the sun gets orange at the bottom and whatnot. And he said, go out in your boat at sunset, top half of the dumping tide, drop your anchor, bait your hook, put a cork on your line an arm's length up, let your line out about a stone's throw. And I said, well, exactly how far is that? He said, oh, just about as far as you can throw a stone. And she says, first you're all Hindu myths, now you're all quaint Yankee. This instruction, I said, went on for a year. We caught striped bass, bluefish, flounder, fluke, tog, squeak. I've got the picture. No, you don't. Not yet. One evening, just as it got dark, he showed up at the end of the dock in his boat. I said, I'll get my fishing rod. He said, nope, just get in. We went out a ways, and he cut the motor. We drifted in the dark. He said, look down. What had happened was that the incoming tide had brought in whole banks of phosphorescent plankton. When something brushed them, they lit up. It was like looking at an X-ray, a living X-ray of everything that was going on down there in the salt water. Big fish made pale green outlines of themselves, then swam off and left dwindling trails of light. An eel made a quick, bright wiggle, then vanished, most likely hid under a ledge. There were other flashes and shimmerings, I couldn't tell what. That part was as if the northern lights were in the sea. Yes, my point is, by the way, of course a mentor helps in practical matters, is an advisor. I'm not saying that isn't so. I'm just saying there's something more important. A mentor points out things he or she has seen that are wonderful in themselves. A mentor points these things out to someone he or she hopes will go on seeing them and point them out to someone else. So that was the guy.
And that, if I may interrupt, is an exact description of the portraits that you all painted. These are people who pointed things out to you so that you would go on and point them out to others. And so that's great, John. Thank you for that.
Can I know what book of yours, John, is that from, please?
That is from Beyond the First Draft, which is a book of literary essays, but they all get outdoors.
Thanks.
and onto salt water or fresh water or whatnot, somehow.
So,
Thank you.
Rob, you wrote this. This is the quote that I was trying to find before by Aldous Huxley, and he says, and he speaks as, he says, a man, we're going to update him, a person misses something by not establishing a participative and living relationship with the non-human world, that of animals and plants, landscapes and stars and seasons. By failing to be vicariously the no-self, he fails to be completely himself. And I thought that was just, and I've never heard it said that way before, that we look for something in nature to not be ourselves with, in order to find ourselves. It's a paradox that I think is really important and something that I would love for you guys to speak to in whatever form.
Yeah, that's an idea I thought a lot about, and that's something that you see again and again, especially these days. We've been talking a lot in our private conversations about a guy named William Cronin, who is an environmental historian and a kind of a philosopher who's leader of this idea of deconstructionism, which is a controversial term. But he basically points out that these ideas, wilderness, nature, these are cultural things that we have inherited from our ancestors, which are not necessarily, we accept them as these natural, real things, when in fact it is of course our understanding of it. It is a cultural construct, and it is helpful to take that apart and start pulling out the pieces and seeing what's there. And one of the things that he does, I think that's really beautiful, people don't give him quite enough credit, is that he deconstructs the wilderness and the notion of nature, and he still manages to love those things. And one of the reasons why he loves them, he loves the wilderness in particular, is because it's the other, the capital O, other. It is this thing that is not us. And it is always, if you go back and read Roderick Nash, all these historians have often come to a similar conclusion that the wilderness was defined as the thing outside the fence, right? We went in, we cleared fields, we built fences, and that out there that's when really wilderness was created. Because as Gloria will tell you, Native Americans did not have a word for nature, they did not have a word for wilderness, they were just a part of it. And so it wasn't until we created this separation that then we had this concept. And so you can look at that and say, well, that's an artificial thing and we don't need to protect it. But in fact, there's a real beauty in this thing which is incredibly complex, incredibly not us, which stubbornly resists our efforts to tame it, to control it, to derive value from it. And I think that's the thing I love most about wilderness, is that, and what I find most beautiful about it, is that it's like this open space. You know, Thoreau writes about beautifully on top of Katahdin his experience in the burnt lands and the unhandselled globe. You know, actually have it. It's on page 222. I just love this quote. He says, he's on top. He says, "This was that earth of which we have heard, made out of chaos and old night. Here was no man's garden but the unhandselled globe. It was not lawn, nor pasture, nor mead, nor woodland, nor lea, nor arable, nor wasteland. Man was not to be associated with it." Again, man, we could say human. "It was matter, vast, terrific, rocks, trees, wind on our cheeks, the solid earth, the actual world, the common sense, contact. Which is this stunning, weird, elliptical rant to go on, but it was because he lived, in Concord, and everything had been tamed, and suddenly to see this real, raw wilderness was this profound, spiritual, noumenal experience for them, and I think that that's something that people throughout history have gone to the wilderness for. It's there are many, countless prophets and cults, and people go out in the wilderness. It's not just religious people, right? And people go out there to make love and do drugs and bury bodies and do all sorts of stuff they're not supposed to do elsewhere. It's the unconstructed space. It's the space out there where sort of anything goes. And I think that, besides the burying bodies, of course, is something worth protecting. It's to have an open space which is not that is not overly managed, both physically and theoretically. To have this free space.
I'm going to butt in because I want to. If I may, thank you.
Yeah.
Because I want to pick up one of the great thrills of reading Rob's book is how many books we have in common. I love it. Tolkien, he talked about Mordor and Thoreau, Cronin, on and on. I went to hear Cronin talk one time, and he started his talk. I'm going to drift from the microphone, so I'm going to lift my voice back to the back wall. And he stood here and he said, "Nature, are we in it, or are we outside it?" And I thought, that is wonderful. That is so good. And for some reason, by the time I got through reading Changes in the Land, Metropolis, and hearing him talk, I thought, wait, he never answered that. But his answer is embedded in it. Both.
Yeah. I have a great quote I actually brought. There's this book called A Natural History of Nature Writing, which is quite an interesting book. And the opening lines are incredible for this because it paints it in actually quite vivid and somewhat dark terms. He says, "In a recent letter, the poet Nick Bozanek reminded me that in medieval times there was a favorite torture cabinet called in English the Little Ease. The box was constructed in such a way that inside it, the imprisoned victim could neither stand up nor lie down. Instead, his agony was to be always uncomfortably in between. Over time, the hapless victim's inability to straighten himself out caused him untold discomfort and eventually a spirit-breaking agony and finally madness. And the unhappy genius of this box is a metaphor for most Americans' relationship to what we call nature. The lack of ease, the dis-ease in our culture is that we can neither quite stand among nor quite lie down peacefully with our fellow creatures. We feel neither entirely one with them nor entirely separate." Which is, it's an intense way of putting it, but I thought it was
And
it's a good way to put it.
you add in Lyme disease,
Yeah.
and the discomfort increases exponentially. So,
Who are you quoting?
This is sorry, I should tell him it's Frank Stewart is this book. Yeah, A Natural History of Nature Writing. Check it out.
Between your buried bodies and torture cabinets,
Well, nature writing, it's a little too flowery. It can all just be peace and butterflies, but you gotta, there's some dark stuff in there as well in nature.
It's true. I've lost track of this path, but what came to me when you first brought this up was how grateful I feel that my first and most powerful experiences in nature have been in a place where I'm allowed to interact with nature, and that's a privilege, right? Because here, where we have a high population, relatively small natural spaces, we have these protocol like leave no trace, and the places where I sort of ended up living in the natural world were places where we're sort of always leaving traces, always finding traces, always, digging snow caves and building fires and chopping down wood to make shelter and always interacting with it in this very visceral way. And then it's odd for me to come back to the United States, and I recognize the importance of that protocol, but it's a loss. It's a loss for people to go into the wilderness and treat it like a museum, where you can't actually physically do things. So I'm fairly fascinated with hunters, trappers, sort of the ways that rural life. I live in a town of 500 people now in Wisconsin, and Norway and Wisconsin are very different, but I'm fascinated by the way that there's a real hunting culture, a trapping culture in my town. And I grew up, I studied environmental law at university. I was sort of on this culture of sort of analytical, lefty, outward bound type stuff, which is very compelling to me. And then I live in this small town, and it's people who don't consider themselves necessarily close to nature because their lives are so integrated. And they are, making their living from this place and looking out for it, and are in some ways so politically aligned with the culture I came up in, and yet there's almost no connection there. So I have no idea what that has to do with the question, but it always strikes me as a loss. I'm always interested in the ways that people, whether it's gardening or something, are able to actually be part of nature. I mean, I have 24 huskies. I don't like this, but I have to feed them meat that would be discarded otherwise from the butcher and the taxidermist in town, and that's meat that would be dumped in the woods from hunters, and so instead of discarding it and wasting it, I feed it to my dogs, and they love it. And it's grotesque, and we get a lot of skinned bear hands, because skinned bear hands look exactly like human hands. And so the taxidermist would dump them in the woods, which is fully legal, and then people would call the sheriff to report murders. And the sheriff called up Owen, the taxidermist, and he said, "Look, Owen, I know this is you. Fairly confident these aren't human hands, but you've got to stop. You've got to stop because you're driving any tourism we have out of the county." And
People who come for nature.
exactly. So I end up, I have this life that's very split between this sort of ethereal, well, at its best moments, dog sledding is this sort of magical, ethereal, silent movement with this pack of animals that you're incredibly close to. Wolves will come run alongside us, which is scary, but so far, so good. And, you end up in places you can't get to any other way, and then at the same time, I'm dumping out sacks of skinned hands every day and watching dogs, So it's this really sort of grotesque and yet what feels to me to be a very true connection to the natural world where I live.
Yeah, I would just speak up, in defense. I think you're recognizing the necessity of leaving no trace, but I think there's actually a beauty to leave no trace as well philosophically. In that, like I said, the summer camp I went to was like going back in time to 1903. And back in 1903, the predominant form of wilderness travel was woodcraft. You would go out into Maine or the Adirondacks or wherever, and you would go out there and cut down a bunch of trees and build pine bough shelters, and your impact was huge. And there was a real beauty in that because you were working with the land. But at the same time, there was there's a manipulative and a kind of arrogant attitude to that as well. It's all here for me. And also, it was all kind of make-believe. They were out, they didn't need to cut down all those trees to do it. It was just a feeling, it was an enjoyable human experience, but it wasn't really a necessity. And so then the shift, as you get these more and more people and the need for leave no trace, I think then starts to infuse our ecological understanding at large, which is we need to leave of course, leave no trace is an ideal. It's not a reality. You never leave no trace. Everyone who walks a trail, this is one of the themes of my book, is everyone who walks a trail changes it a little bit. And in fact, the act of walking on a hiking trail makes you acutely aware of your ethical responsibility as a person on this planet, because oftentimes the trail will not go where you want it to go. And as a hiker, especially a long distance hiker, it's frustrating as hell, because you want to get to where you're walking 30 miles a day. You don't want to be screwing around on switchbacks like this. You want to go the fastest way possible, the path of least resistance. But the hiking trail, the people who build hiking trails design them that way so that they shed water efficiently, so that they don't foul up rivers, so they don't mess up, sensitive ecosystems. There's thought behind it, but you can't see that as a hiker. So the leave no trace thing is, traveling camp on durable surfaces. One of the principles. Stay on the trail. Don't go off. If it's muddy, just walk through the mud. Don't go off on the sides. That's a really tricky thing. Most people don't do it, but I think that the idea of all of us, on this planet thinking like we need to have things that are more to travel and camp on durable surfaces, reduce our impact, obviously don't cut down a tree for no reason. All of that is actually, I think it's infusing like generations of kids with pretty good, a pretty good outlook on the planet.
John,
Well, I think I'm going back a couple of
questions?
paragraphs or something, but because two things occurred to me. One was that I remember when I was, I think about 10, I was walking around a fairly big lake. There was a trail, and I stopped and looked through the water, and I saw a light coming from someplace, from a rock down beneath, and it came up in circles towards me, and I know that the sun moved as I looked at that, so it was some time. And I came to it, I was 10. I thought, I wasn't myself. And I think that's one of the things. And I'm thinking, well, but that's not just the nature. That can be anything of wonder, to wonder at. And because, and I was put in mind of this many years past, and I went to San Sepolcro, which was the hometown of Piero della Francesca, and saw the resurrection. And I was just, it was, and after that I went and had lunch. The best way to look at art, I think, is to go from town to town and look at one painting, and then have lunch. And then you go to another
your
one.
Your grandmother instilled that in you with her ski and then
The
I'll
skiing,
feed you.
yeah. So,
I think we need to move on to
Yes.
questions from the audience, because I think we're
oh my God,
at a point
how
where
time
we can
flies.
do that. Yeah,
Oh.
John.
Blair,
Yes.
nobody explained why suddenly you were in Lapland as a 4-year-old kid. And what is Iditarod?
Okay, so the Iditarod is a 1,100-mile dog sled race across Alaska that it generally takes 8 to 10 days, depending on the weather. It is not the hardest dog sled race out there, but it is the most commercial and famous, which means that in practical terms, in terms of being able to have sponsors for my dog team and be able to keep doing the sport, that's a benefit of working toward it. It's also just a wonderful legacy to be part of, and fun. And in terms of how I ended up in Norway, I lived there with my parents before I went back on my own, because my father works in tobacco prevention, and Norway was instituting a smoking ban, which made us extremely unpopular.
Anybody else? Questions? Yes, Bob.
I don't know if this is a question, but I want to make a comment, which is that it seems there are two cultures that exist. There is a culture of nature people, and there's a culture of urban people. And I'm thinking about how, for me, you guys seem like Martians. The fact the fact that you have spent, as someone who grew up in a totally urban culture, and especially an urban culture that comes from the Jewish background in Eastern Europe that always lived in cities, because that was the only place they could live, and then emigrated to more cities in different countries, that the notion of living as you do, Rob, because I happen to know how you live now, is like being in an alien world. And I don't know if I'm making any comment, but I'm just observing that this, to me, is like hearing about a life that is inconceivable.
And what you're saying historically is actually really interesting, because what you find when you go back and you look at the history of who nature people are is, in fact, nature people were oftentimes urban people, almost overwhelmingly in the beginning, urban people who felt that the industrialism and the pace of urban life was overwhelming and they needed to get out. Because other people, we did not call rural people nature people, right? Those are just people who lived on the land, who worked on the land, but they weren't there for this mystical nature experience. That happens in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, as the Romanticism starts to come over from Europe, and all of it has to do with the encroachment of industrialism becoming urban life becoming too hectic, too polluted, and then needing these other spaces to go and reconnect to nature. And what I find really interesting about that, and what you're saying as well, I was thinking about this last night with M.K. Asante, is that this book, A Natural History of Nature Writing, is basically runs down the canon of nature writing, right? And so you got Henry David Thoreau, John Burroughs, John Muir, Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, Edward Abbey. So it's like 7 white guys and a white woman, right? And there's the number of people of color in nature writing is strikingly low. We were talking about this last time. There's some great native writers, but it's part of that is the question of who gets to define what nature is. And there's really good work being done now by black writers saying, hey, we have a lot of experience and relationship with nature as well. It's just not the nature that you are describing. That we've been, there's a great book called Trace by Laurent Savoy, and she describes the way that she and her family and her ancestors have been relating to nature in the South, and it's oftentimes more agricultural. It's in different contexts. But the black experience in nature has been written out because black people were not allowed to, they weren't given a voice in that dialogue. And I find that question, this is where deconstructing nature, again, gets really helpful. It's like, who gets to say what nature is? Who gets to say what's natural, right? I mean, that's where it gets really poignant. I mean, especially for me, when we're talking about the gay marriage debate and someone tells me that, being gay is not natural. I'm like, well, it's not natural for you, but it's sure as hell natural for me. and so all of these things, the word nature, I mean, and you're touching on it, is just a fascinating ball of complexity that when you start pulling it apart, there's so much history and intricacy there.
But there's another aspect to it, is when you think about people in the dichotomy between the classic nature and the classic urban, the other element is that people who identify, I said when one identifies as gay or doesn't identify as gay, but the people who identify in the world of nature are also people who are alone a lot. And then the choice to go into nature is also a choice to limit your relationship to a large number of other people. And I think part of the question, I'd like to hear what you all have to say about it, but the notion of being alone, lonely, or disconnected to your fellow human beings, except for the eccentrics that you meet during your process, is something that I would like to hear you talk about.
Well, I'll just really briefly say, because I feel like I've been monopolizing this part of the conversation, but I do, I mean, what you're saying is really interesting, because on the Appalachian Trail, you do actually find these communities of hikers who get very quickly bonded, and you get these little, instant kind of utopian communities where everyone's sharing their food and sharing their stories, and it's a really beautiful thing, and then they break apart, and then you bump into people months later, and it's like seeing an old friend, I have a really beautiful passage and anecdote that I describe in the book that I witnessed a guy named Gil Jackson, who believes he's the first full-blooded Cherokee man to hike the Appalachian Trail. And he's in his, I believe he's in his 60s, his early 60s when he did it. I went up, he was a friend of mine, he was actually in an earlier chapter, I'd interviewed him, and I said, if you ever hike the Appalachian Trail, let me know. So I went up and hiked with him in New Hampshire. He was really flagging near the end of his hike because he was kicking ass. He was moving much quicker than I was. And I watched as all the other hikers came together and said, if you want to get to the end of the trail, we'll get you there. Like, we'll help carry your tent. They were all offering, and it was this beautiful moment, because we do think that the wilderness is this place where people go to be away from other people. And that's oftentimes true, but it's also a place where people come together in new ways, and I find that beautiful as well.
Yeah, I'd second that. I mean, it's a place away from technology. It's a place where the people you're with, you're collaborating with in a way that simply being adjacent to other people in a more urban area doesn't force you to do. I'm often alone with my dogs, and my experience with that is that I feel less human. I sort of stop thinking in words, and I'm part of this pack, even though I'm also outside it. But when I'm with people, I mean, then the bonds you form are so strong and so immediate, because in some ways you owe your lives to each other.
John?
You said, sir, alone, lonely, disconnected. Lonely and alone are very different. I love being alone when I want to work, and I'm not really alone because things and people are flooding into my thoughts and my imagination. And I'm also not alone because writing is semi-hypnotic in many ways. And suddenly you thought, how did I think of that? I'm not that smart. It just came. So I'm not only that, and then I'm perfectly happy. And Rob and you are right. When you are out doing something and it requires help, or someone else requires help, it's more instantaneous and without thought. Just, yeah, of course you help. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Something you just touched on, John, is the writing. I'm kind of interested, particularly Blair and Rob, when did you decide you're going to write this experience? Is it something you're writers by nature and you always have done diaries and what have you? And you mentioned that it's, in some cases it's years between when you conceive of what you're going to do and how you actually polish it, and John Vance. Talk about how you got a book on your desk.
Yeah.
How did it come to be something?
Yeah. It's funny. I was just going through. My dad made me clear out this storage unit where I'd been keeping all my childhood stuff, and I found all these great old pieces of paper, and one of them was a nature. I mean, I think I was writing. I don't even know, but this was at age 8 or 9. There was a newspaper contest for this nature poem, and I wrote some poem about the desert where I'd never been. I just sort of made it up, and I had all these words. I used the word eyrie, like an eagle's nest, and I was like, how the hell did I know the word eyrie when I was 8 years old? I have no idea where this poem came from. It's like you're saying, it was beamed into my brain. I mean, it's the strangest thing. I ended up winning this little newspaper, a local newspaper contest. And then I remember that when I really sort of, my second grade teacher came to my reading in Vermont, and we talked about this, that I remember, which, at the end of the year, they would collect all the kids' stories together into this like little literary magazine, for 8-year-olds. And she didn't put my poem in the literary magazine because I came up to her, I was furious, I'm 8 years old, and I'm like, this is ridiculous, we won the contest in the newspaper, how is it not in the literary magazine? She said, Robert, we have to spread it around, like, you have to let other kids have their moment too. And I think that like, I had that weird intensity from that age and through high school. I mean, I look back on it, and the sort of Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours, I was writing in my head all the time. I was just describing things constantly, and I was reading. I described being addicted to television as a kid, and then my mom would punish me and say, you can't watch television, so I would rebel by reading books, which is like, it was the least rebellious form of rebellion, but I was like, you can't stop me from reading. Yeah, and it worked. I mean, it was very shrewd of her. But I would read just obsessively, addictively. I described it as like chain smoking. I was picking one up as I was putting the other down. And then when I went to college, I wanted to be a fiction writer. I was studying postmodern fiction, metafiction, stuff like just very abstruse writing that no one really wanted to read because I wasn't doing it very well. And I finally found my way into nonfiction. Thankfully, my senior year, I switched at the last moment. And from there, I knew I wanted to write a book. And in fact, I thought this book would originally be a book about the Appalachian Trail. And I went around and said, I'm going to write everyone's only read one book about the Appalachian Trail, right? It's A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. Everyone's read it. It's a wonderful book. But I wanted to write a different book. I wanted to write a book that was a little more contemplative, a little more literary. And I would go around and tell people this idea, and their eyes would just glaze over. They're like, read another book about an Appalachian Trail, a white guy. And so I picked up on that, thankfully. This would be my one tip as a writer, is like pay attention to how people respond to your ideas, because you can tell if there's juice there, if there's a little bit of electricity. And then eventually I just thought there would be a little chapter about trails, insect trails, animal trails, and I kept collecting pieces. This would be my other advice, is just collect pieces obsessively and just put them in a file and just keep them, because one day, you never know. And so this file eventually got bigger than like the other file of my Appalachian Trail things. And the idea, I describe it like an iceberg tipping over. I realized that like suddenly I had a book about trails, and the Appalachian Trail was this little piece inside of it. And then I was terrified because this book is much bigger than the other book I was going to write. I've got to go and learn about the history of, animals and ancient, native cultures and just so much. And so that's why I went, and I was in grad school. I was working as a fact checker at New York Magazine. I got this fellowship that allowed me to quit the job at New York Magazine, and then through that I got an agent, and then it just was like this concatenation of good, fortune, and that got me to a book deal. And then I took way too long to write the book, and blew past my deadline, and all that stuff. So that's how it took me 7 years, and that's how this book came to be, I guess.
It is interesting that we have two first-time writers here, and then a venerable writer in the form of John Casey. So you might have a different experience, John. But Blair, if you want to address sort of how your book came about, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky. I got a fellowship at the University of Iowa for 3 years, which gave me paid time to write, and that was where I did much of this. Like you, I just have always been, describing in my head from the moment I don't even know if anyone thinks without just describing things in their head, like writing whatever's happening in scene. That's how I think. And so I knew I wanted to write about the Arctic because I was fascinated. I knew that I wanted to write about gender and to some degree sexual violence because that was something I was trying to figure out in my own life. And somehow, those things were also connected to each other for me. So I wrote this sort of on and off. The time from selling it to HarperCollins and having it come out was just under 4 years. My writing advice would be that I always think of writing as a form of communication. And I mean, that's very obvious, but I never worry about writer's block because that just means you don't have something to say right then. And someday you will, at some point you will, and why would you force yourself to write when you don't actually have something to say? That's going to be writing that doesn't matter. So that's been my biggest thing is I actually have a very cyclical writing process where for a couple months I'll write a lot and then I won't. And, other writers will say, aren't you stressed? You don't know what you're working on next. And I'm not. I sort of take it as a vacation because I know that at some point I'm going to obsessively have to write something again when my thoughts have been turning over enough that I have something to communicate. But I don't know how many of you are writers. But I would encourage you not to worry about the times when you're not writing. If you're a writer, then everything you do is writing.
Hail to thee, blithe spirit. There's some darker moments, but maybe you'll never have them. I just want to say one thing to you, John. Barrett, because it's been in my head ever since. You're carefully heard, observed, and written, basically sort of dialogue at the dinner table with the rat exterminator is so, I mean, it is, manages to merge several things. Totally Italian, the guy is. And very shrewd, which is one of the words the Italians use as a compliment. Lui è molto furbo. He's very sly, and yeah, that's a thumbs up. But I mean, anyway, but your attention to that is, as I think back, it's exactly the kind of attention that one pays to How to Train a Dog, how to catch fish, how to you know how to track things. So it's and anyway, if those of you who didn't hear that, go find it.
Or you can read it.
Yes, it won't be. Yeah, it was brilliantly read too.
Yes, for sure.
This is an appreciation for the writers who have to translate physical and actual experiences into the written word. And this is really what this festival is meant to celebrate, is this skill and genius of people who think the way you say you think. Most of us do not. We're not always describing things in our head. We don't have those words. And we look to you all to do that in ways that are going to enlighten us and make us feel part of the thing that you're part of. So is there anybody else who has a question?
I just wanted to add to that. I think that readers have just as important a voice like a singer. They're as important to a composer. They'll take a piece of music, they'll add their own journey, their senses, all five senses to it to see what they're giving to that piece. No two singers are alike, no two readers are alike. And as important as the authors are, I believe that we're here to celebrate the readers that are giving of their time, sharing, that are taking the time to get and delve into every single word and take the power of these words and make them live on forever.
That's like we're
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I love that you pointed that out, because that is a sort of covert theme in my book. Is if you think of the author of the trail, the creators of the trail as the author, then readers are the walkers. And one of the things I describe is that every person who walks a trail changes it a little bit, right? And every person who reads a book changes it a little bit, because in the collective imagination it starts to evolve and it starts to spread and it starts to actually change its meaning, right? Because it's not my book anymore. It's your guys' book, right? It's out there in the world. And one of the things I tried to do in the back of the book is have a little email address where people can write to me with comments, suggestions, corrections, all sorts of grammatical corrections and typos. That is, and hopefully, and that's just something I'd like to see as books move into the digital age more, for it to be available more and more, is to be able to continually update the book. So it's this ever-evolving thing, because it's just a matter of technological circumstance that we print books on paper and it's fixed. It doesn't have to be that way. They could be shifting if we want them to be, and they could grow and evolve as this collective creation. And so I love what you said. You said it beautifully, and I think, yeah, so thank you.
Is there anybody else who has a question or a comment? Are we ready to wrap this up? It seems
Yes.
Thank you.
That was good. Nice overview.
I like your jump.
That's exactly.